I'm going to just start slowly and build into this. So we have a lot to cover today. So I want, again, I'm Harvey Kaminski. I am a passionate and now already a longtime member of the American Friends of Bar-Ilan board. And I am very involved with the school for many years, and it's brought me not just great happiness, but also I've learned a lot, and uh, I have had the benefit of meeting some of the greatest professors in the world at the school, and we have two excellent professors today also. Actually, one is a doctor and one is a professor, but I'll get to that in a moment. Anyway, today's webinar is entitled it's titled "A Playbook for Today's Challenges. What would Rabbi Sacks say?" We all know about the great Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, former chief rabbi of England, who passed away a few years ago, and his legacy has been growing ever since his passing. Rabbi Sacks passed actually 5 years ago. He was an extraordinary leader whose voice combined intellectual depth, moral clarity, and an uncommon ability to bring people together. This is extremely important today in view of what happened this past weekend in Australia, the terrible, terrible massacre of Jewish people on the beach in Sydney. And will also cover what Rabbi Sacks' reaction would have been to this terrible event. At a moment when social fragmentation, ethical strain, and rising hostility toward Jewish communities feel painfully close to home, Rabbi Sacks' teachings remain not only relevant but urgently practical. So today we will explore how his ideas can help illuminate Israel's moral and ethical path forward in a post-war landscape, and how they can strengthen unity and resilience across world Jewry, and how they also deal with the growing problem of anti-Semitism worldwide. So, as I mentioned earlier, we are really honored and privileged to be joined by two distinguished Bar-Ilan scholars. First, Professor Jonathan Rynhold, who I've gotten to know. Excuse me. He's the academic director of the Jonathan Sacks Institute, and he is joined by Dr. Tanya White, a lecturer in Tanach and Jewish Philosophy at Bar-Ilan, whose work focuses on Rabbi Sacks' political philosophy. The Jonathan Sacks Institute raises awareness about Rabbi Sacks' ever-relevant ideas within academia and develops a diverse network of alumni leaders who can make practical impact on the Jewish future. Together, Professor Rynhold and Dr. White will examine Rabbi Sacks' principles of thoughtful leadership and apply them to the dilemmas of our time. Again, I thank you all for being here, and let us get right into it. And I'll start with a bunch of questions, and they're directed both to Dr. White and to Professor Rynhold. The first question is, what would Rabbi Sacks recommend as the best path forward to heal and unify a fractured Israeli society after 2 years of war? Who wants to take that?
Okay. Tanya, do you want to start off and then I'll join in?
Yeah, okay. So it's wonderful to be here this evening. I know that we're coming on the heels of everything that's been happening over the last few days, and our hearts and minds are obviously with the Australian community. And I know that, we're also really on the heels of a very challenging 2 years. And many times, I mean, Rabbi Sacks was obviously a leader for so many people and a voice of moral clarity for Jews and non-Jews worldwide. But Rabbi Sacks was also personally my mentor. I met with him on many occasions. He directed me, he helped me, he imbued me with a sense of agency and choices that I needed to make in my life. And obviously was somebody who informed me in my intellectual, I guess, trajectory. And I think more than anything, one of the reasons why so many people have been asking me over the last, 5 years since his passing, what would Rabbi Sacks say? Because when he was alive, he had this incredible ability to hold so many different perspectives, both an incredible amount of secular knowledge and wisdom, and at the same time, a very deep and poignant understanding of Jewish wisdom. And he had the ability to kind of hold these two things together, which I think is a very, very unique way of understanding how what he called chokhmah, universal wisdom, can be appropriated for the Torah, for particular wisdom, and how the Torah, which is particular wisdom, can be appropriated for chokhmah, for universal wisdom. And that, to me, is the essence, is the centrality of his political philosophy. It's very unusual to have a rabbi have really a novel of political philosophy, and that's what Rabbi Sacks had. And I think as we enter into kind of the time after the war, and we now enter into a space where the diaspora, in some senses, are feeling such a massive kind of impact also of anti-Semitism and what's going on, we have to ask, how would Rabbi Sacks, in what language would he speak about healing and unifying Israeli society and just generally the Jewish people? And as I always say when people ask me, we don't know what Rabbi Sacks would say. He's not alive to speak to us in this moment, but we do know what he did say. We are so lucky that he was a prolific writer and left us with an enormous legacy of written, spoken works that we can tap into. And so with that in mind, I want to kind of think about what perhaps or how through the prism of his political philosophy can we understand the challenges today. And I think Rabbi Sacks was very good at diagnostics, and he always first, whenever any book, I always say, he wrote so many beautiful commentaries on the Torah, but in order to really understand the basis of his Torah commentary, it's imperative to read his philosophical books. And in his philosophy books, he always begins with a diagnostic. He always has a challenge, a societal challenge that he is speaking to. In his early books, he was speaking to challenges within the Jewish community. They were perhaps slightly more parochial. In his later books, once his platform became wider, he moved outwards. And in every book, he diagnoses the situation. And so I think we need to first start with asking the question of what are the problems we're facing? And I think first and foremost, we all know the general problem we're feeling universally is the problem of polarization. And polarization is essentially the idea that I don't really see anyone outside the peripheral vision of my, narrow vision, right? That's what polarization is. Polarization in Israel is exactly the same thing. We're not seeing each other. We're not hearing each other. We're speaking in our own echo chambers. The second really big problem I think Rabbi Sacks addressed, and the only book he really addressed Israel specifically was in his book Future Tense. And he spoke in that book, and I think it's still a problem that echoes today, is that there is a breakdown of a shared narrative here in Israel. Now, Rabbi Sacks spoke about the importance of shared narratives generally in any society, whether it's British society, American society, but specifically here in Israel, there's many sectarian groupings, and we've lost, in Peter Berger, who Rabbi Sacks quoted very often, this sacred canopy, this canopy that it can sit over us and give us this sense of a sacred narrative that we can all tap into. And I think, living here in Israel as I do, coming on the heels of the trauma, and there is so much trauma at so many different levels, the big question of how we integrate trauma, and trauma cannot be integrated. A rupture in our history cannot be integrated if we don't have some form of unified narrative to integrate it into. And so I think that's also a very big question. And in order to kind of answer the question, I think the best thing to do, and Rabbi Sacks does this, is he observes 3 times in Jewish history that we went into exile, 3 times that there was a major crisis. We've gone through many crises, but a major crisis, a major rupture. And he says it like this. He says the first time is the story of Joseph, which is what we're reading in the Torah readings at the moment. And again, if we look at the story, it's a story of people not seeing each other. It's a story of people blaming and shaming. The second is the Babylonian exile, the first temple destruction, which also, if we look, comes on the heels of the split between the North and the Southern Kingdom. Again, people not seeing each other, people not acknowledging each other. And the third is the Roman destruction of the Second Temple, which we know, according to the rabbis as well, was sinat chinam, which was, a baseless hatred and due to a lot of sectarianism within the Jewish community. And if we look at one thing that underpins all of these times of exile, all of these times where there's been a rupture and a fissure in the Jewish community, all of them go back to this idea, again, an idea, very modern idea of polarization, the idea that we're speaking in echo chambers, we're not seeing each other, we're not feeling each other, and there's no overriding sacred canopy of communication, of a narrative that is shared. And so Rabbi Sacks says like this: if we want to know how healing is going to happen, first and foremost, we have to look to what he calls the third arena of society. He says every society should have three arenas: the state, which is politics, the market, which is economy, and the third arena, which is what he calls civil society, community. And Rabbi Sacks argues that Israel has a lacking in the third arena. What does that mean? Now, it's funny because you would think that Israel is a very communal, and we know that it comes highest on the happiness charts because of the fact that there is this sense of community. But Rabbi Sacks argues that Zionism has two phases. The first phase in Zionism was interested, Ben Gurion's mamlachtiyut. It was interested in building the state apparatus because we never had that before. And that was necessary to build the first democratic, liberal, sovereign Jewish state. He said, but the problem was that when we focused on the state apparatus, we actually forgot that one of the most important elements in building a sustainable, healthy society is the third arena, the arena of civil society. And Rabbi Sacks argues that was our downfall. Now, in Rabbi Sacks's writings, there is a theme that comes up again and again. And that is the theme of contract versus covenant. Rabbi Sacks says we all know, many of us know if we're into political philosophy, that we have what are called the social contract theorists, people like Rousseau and Hobbes and Locke, and they all spoke about the creation of a state, and they focused on this idea of what they call the social contract. But I want you to imagine for a second what a contract is. And in order to say, let me just very briefly give you a scenario. Johnny, I'm going to let you speak in 1 second. I've kind of gone on a monologue here. You and your neighbors hire a security company, right? And you pay them for their services to protect you. And then they fail and you fire them because they're not doing what they need to, and you find another one. What we're doing there is it's transactional. Everyone is there for their mutual advantage, but it emphasizes contract. Covenant, says Rabbi Sacks, which is the third arena, which is civil society, which is where we're going to find a shared narrative, which is what he believes Israeli society, what he calls the Zionist phase 2, is what we haven't invested in. That is, the scenario is you and your neighbors create a neighborhood watch. Nobody's paid. We do it because we care for each other. We do it because we have a shared project, a shared vision. We meet regularly. Everyone knows each other's children's. When someone's in trouble, we show up. It's not transactional. It's voluntary, but it's binding, and it's mutual responsibility. The social contract philosophers spoke about contract as the basis of a nation, a society. Rabbi Sacks speaks about covenant as the basis of a society, and he argues that the state cannot provide covenantal goods. It can't provide belonging and meaning and moral formation and identity, all the things that make life meaningful and valuable. And so what he argues is we have to tap back in to that third arena, the arena of voluntary associations, of civil society, of neighborhoods, of religious communities, of charitable organizations, all of the things that allow individuals to flourish, not through contractual relationships, but through covenantal. That is what he calls civil society. And in many ways, the modern state of Israel has that in a way that many other places don't. But maybe what Rabbi Sacks says is that we don't have it enough at the moment to create this what he calls the common good narrative, a narrative that is the sacred canopy of society that we can all tap into. And maybe through that narrative, we are able to get through our trauma and able to integrate.
Thank you very much, Professor Rynhold. Would you like to add to that, or?
Sure, sure. I think what I would like to do is build on what Tanya said. But before I do that, I'd like to tell you something about Tanya, which is directly relevant to this. And that is one of the things that Tanya mentioned is the ability of us to have a shared narrative, a shared space that we agree on. And Tanya was asked very recently to be the keynote speaker at an American Jewish Committee event. And it was the first time a religious Orthodox person, never mind an Orthodox woman, had been asked to do this. And the person who asked her, who's obviously a senior person in the organization, had always been very firm on not bringing religion in. And he'd heard Tanya's podcast on Rabbi Sacks and some of the things that she said today, and he was so wowed that he invited her to have this prestigious position as the keynote speaker. So I think that in a way, what Tanya was saying is not just theory about bringing the Jewish world together; it's something that she's actually done by teaching in her podcast about Rabbi Sacks. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. What I'd like to do is bring this
Thank you for
into
promoting that.
Yashikoa, go ahead.
Okay. What I'd like to do is bring this a little bit more to nuts and bolts, to practical issues in Israel. So there are two things that are dividing Israel, particularly at the moment. And one is the right and the center, because there isn't much of a left in Israel. Okay, so one is those who support the Netanyahu government and those who oppose the Netanyahu government. And another, which is interrelated to that, is the issue of the ultra-Orthodox of the Haredim and them not serving in the army. So let's look at those two issues in light of what Tanya had to say. So for Rabbi Sacks, yeah, there are some values that we have to share. Okay. And for Israel, that would be the Jewish identity of the society and of the country, and that we have a bond that holds us together, shared by common history, common threats, yeah, and those sorts of things. And we also have one based on values. And for Rabbi Sacks, a Jewish polity has to be a polity in which the rule of law applies, that there's equality before the law. We have some degree of separation of power. In other words, the judiciary is independent from the government, and the Knesset, the legislative, is independent from both of those. And we guarantee basic civil rights, like a Bill of Rights in the United States. Now, in Israel, up to now, all of this has been done in an informal way, completely different from the United States. Okay. And then within that, Rabbi Sacks would say it's not so much about what you're arguing, so long as you're within that consensus, it's how you argue, it's how you debate. So one of Rabbi Sacks's favorite philosophers is someone called Alistair McIntyre, who said tradition is a socially embodied argument, in part about what constitutes the tradition. And what that means is if you say you're Jewish, you do Jewish things, or you're Israeli and Jewish and do Israeli things, then you're part of the tradition. And we argue, about what exactly it means. And we do so in the spirit of Beit Hillel, right? We do it in the spirit of we're working towards getting to the best answer that we can. And so long as you're honest about that, then that's fine. That will hold us together, because for democracy to work and for there not to be a civil war, the minority needs to accept the opinion of the majority. And they do so not because they think the majority is right, but because they think that A, the majority will treat them properly, and B, another day they might be the majority and their view will hold. And so we respect each other. What we have at the moment in Israel is a problem that the word Jewish is associated with the right, and the word democratic is associated with the center. And what Rabbi Sacks represented was an integration of the two. In other words, in his works, he tries to show that things that we see as part of democracy are deeply rooted in the Jewish political tradition. Okay, and many of his books are about those issues. And and on the other hand, what he's saying is in a modern society, the particular identities that we have are the sort of things that really motivate us in our social lives, in our communities to do good. And that you need both, and therefore that democracy and Judaism, or democracy and religion, are things that go together. And then it's a different kind of argument, because then it's an argument of where do we put the emphasis given we share these two values, and we can differ exactly how we do that. But we're not arguing I'm 100% right and you're 100% wrong, and that we don't share anything other than Hamas wants to kill us. What we're saying is there are real values that we share. And I think Rabbi Sacks's legacy is that by being able to speak the language of religion and the language of modern democratic political thought, he's able to create a space where people can talk and debate and see each other's as partners in a conversation about what's the best way to run Israel rather than enemies. And I think that is very important and a deep lesson of the three cases that Tanya spoke about, particularly the last one, that the Second Temple and Jewish independence was destroyed because of because of groundless hatred. And I would say that for Rabbi Sacks, politics is not an arena which is about the whole truth, right? You can't have pure truth in our world. That's something that only exists in God's world because only God's perfect. So what we do is we reach understandings that are the best that we can come up with at a particular time. And the more people that are part of the conversation, the more likely it is that we're going to get a better answer because we've got more minds at work, so long as they do so in a spirit of listening and not only talking and on the basis of those shared values. So I think Rabbi Sacks would try hard not to say a particular view about what's going on and would try and emphasize how we talk to each other. Having said that, I'm sure that if you asked him privately, yeah, he would not be very happy with the idea that at a time of war, when many Israelis are doing hundreds of days of reserve duty, that the Israeli government is encouraging and trying to pass a law which will exempt the ultra-Orthodox from army service. I doubt very much he would say that publicly, but I think he would be involved privately to try and find a compromise that both sides can live with and that answers the basic commitment that Jewish people and Jewish Israeli citizens should have to defending, us, to defending the people, and that it shouldn't be that people who study Torah should not be a part of that. I think that I'm pretty sure he would confirm that, but I think he would see his role, not being a politician, yeah, as trying to bring people together on those things rather than taking a public side. So I hope that answers the question, Harvey.
It does. I guess the only comment I want to make about that is, I guess it actually leads to the next question, which is, what are the primary moral and ethical dilemmas facing Israel in the post-war environment, and how do Rabbi Sacks' teachings address them? One is obviously what you're talking about is the problem with the draft, correct? I mean, that's an
Yeah.
ethical dilemma. And the question I just have for you quickly is it possible that there's such a different divergence in view that it's impossible to compromise? Because, as you said, part of the covenant is that we're all part of Israel, but there are sects of Haredim that don't feel that way. So, just sometimes isn't it just impossible to get to that covenant because of the view about Israel about some of the Haredim?
So I would give you the example that before 1977,
Hmm.
not all Haredim didn't serve in the army. There were a certain number of Haredim that were exempted, and the rest had to serve in the army. So the idea that Israel has always exempted Haredim is simply wrong.
I
They've got used to it. They don't want to change it, but they have lived with it before. And not only that, there are many, many religious Zionist Israelis who study in yeshiva and serve in the army. And I'm not saying that every single ultra-Orthodox person should serve in the army. It's neither sensible from the army's point of view, nor is it realistic in terms of Haredi society. But there are many Haredim who, if they weren't under pressure from their rabbis, would serve in the army. And we don't need all of them to serve. We need enough of them to serve to do two things. One, because Israel is short of combat soldiers. Right? It is actually does not have enough. And secondly, so that Israelis, secular Israelis and religious Israelis, feel that they're not doing all the fighting and paying all the taxes while the Haredim don't be a part of it. So I do definitely think that it is possible to reach understandings. But it's not just
It's
about the
difficult.
philosophy.
It's
It's also about the
right.
politics. Yeah. Yeah.
Got it. Understood. Dr. White, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I'll also add to that. I think if you look in Rabbi Sacks's book, Future Tense, he sets out, there's a chapter there specifically on Israel. As I said, I think it's the only place that he actually addresses the problems existing in Israel in a comprehensive and explicit way, meaning there's places where he implicitly refers to Israel, but he always said that he didn't like to comment on Israel because obviously he wasn't living there, wasn't a rabbi there. But that is the only place that he really comprehensively kind of addresses the challenges. It was written in 2009, so it's a while ago. But one of the things he speaks about there, which he speaks about in all, over all different ranges of writings of his political philosophy, is the importance of the separation of religion and state. For Rabbi Sacks, and this is, one of the founding principles for him of a democracy, right? And he bases himself very much on, Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a French diplomat that went to go and visit America, in its founding days in the late 1800s, and came back and spoke about the fact that America was this incredibly individualistic society and yet extremely communal. And one of the reasons why he said that and had a burgeoning, civil society arena, the third arena, if you remember what I spoke about, the reason why he believes that was, and this is what de Tocqueville writes about, is because there was a real separation of religion and state. Why? Because the founding fathers and the religious leaders believed that religion should be about influence and not power. Because the moment religion becomes about power, it becomes corrupt. And therefore, if religion wants to influence society, it has to do so through the third arena, through the civil society arena, and not through the state, and not through the economy, not through the market. And I think Rabbi Sacks would argue that what we're seeing today is the result of religion and state not being divided, not being separated adequately. And therefore, what's happened is that religion, unfortunately, has become corrupt. And it's a really sad state of affairs that people, in the last 2 years, actually, we have seen, I would say, like a spiritual renaissance of sorts. But that is separate to the fact that many secular Israelis, many of whom I speak to, I live with, I meet, and many of them really feel a contempt, and I'm using that word specifically, a contempt towards religion, because they believe that the religious parties, the more Haredi, the more ultra-Orthodox religious parties, are what religion is about. And the way that they see it, they are corrupt. And therefore they say, well, religion must be corrupt. What I try to do is to try and bring the moderate religion to the fore, and the ethical religion to the fore, and show them that that's really not the case. And actually, the religious parties do not represent authentic Jewish religion. But this is why we've got this dilemma that we found ourselves in, where the ultra-Orthodox religious parties possess an inordinate amount of power. And what's happened is that they are not actually tapping into this idea of the common good, of a central narrative, and it's corrupting not just politics, but actually corrupting and damaging society, not just on a value base, but actually on a very literal, pragmatic basis now, because we don't have enough soldiers to fight. And it's a very, very disillusioning situation and a very painful situation. But I kind of wanted just to touch on one other aspect. So that's like a major aspect. And I think Professor Rynhold has addressed that. And I think it's something that I don't know if Rabbi Sacks would have a solution necessarily. I think he would encourage us to separate religion and state. I think he would encourage us again to tap into maybe even the lowest common denominator of a common narrative that we could all find and tap into. And there are, by the way, grassroots organizations in Israel that are trying to do this. Things like Harivon Haravi'i, the fourth quarter, there are grassroots that are trying to do this and trying to bring dialogue amongst all of these people. But there's another element which I personally have been exposed to because my daughter's a soldier, and a lot of her friends have been in Gaza for many, many, many months, even years. And one of the things that I think is a real issue is this idea of ethical trauma. And I think generally as a nation, I think it's something that's not spoken about a lot. And I think it's something that's really affecting many, many soldiers, and actually I think even affecting us as a nation. And that is the idea of when we are forced into morally compromising situations where we have no choice but to survive, to fight, to survive. Sometimes we are going to be put in a situation where we're going to have to do things that don't feel ethically pure. And I think that Rabbi Sacks was an aspirational thinker. He was a visionary. He was someone who, if you look throughout his writings, the model that he always kind of taps into is Abraham. Abraham was the person whose tent was open on all sides. Abraham was the person who, when his wife Sarah said, get rid of Hagar and Ishmael, he was like, no, I'm not doing that until God says, listen to the voice of your wife, right? Abraham was someone who was grounded in a deep and overriding moral conscience. But there are moments when that moral conscience, that pure ethical conscience, Jewish conscience, I call it, Kol Yaakov, right? The voice of Yaakov, right? There are moments when we have to put on the arms of Esav, right? Which is what Yaakov was forced to do by his mother. There's moments when we have to exit the tent, where we can't stay in that pure ethical mode because our survival is dependent on it. And in those moments, sometimes we do things that are very difficult, right? When you're fighting a battle and your enemy is putting children, their own children, in harm's way, there are very few choices that are put before you. But that doesn't mean that we don't have trauma from those events. It doesn't mean as a nation, as a soldiers, individuals, we're not suffering with trauma. I was interviewed by someone in London when I released the Rabbi Sacks podcast, and they said to me, wouldn't Rabbi Sacks say, he was very much a Judaism engaged with the world as one of his platforms, that his rabbinic platforms, a Judaism engaged in the world. And, a very outward, open tent policy. Judaism has to always go out into the world and represent, this ethical voice. And she said, wouldn't Rabbi Sacks have been very disappointed in the Israeli government's kind of very militaristic campaign in Gaza? And I said to her, listen, I can't say what Rabbi Sacks would have said right now, right? It's not for me to say, but I can say one thing, and that is that I do believe that and Rabbi Sacks always said this, when Israel is attacked in an unprecedented way by its enemies, right? We have the moral duty to protect ourselves probably at whatever cost, because survival has to endure. And that moral choice means that sometimes we have to put up our borders in a literal and metaphorical way. Sometimes we have to compromise the Abrahamic open tent policy and engage with the Sarah throw away the enemy to survive policy, or put on the hands of Esav policy, but never forget the Kol Kol Yaakov. We have to always remember that deep within us, we are the voice of an ethical world, of a moral world. We are the voice that has moral conscience, and we can never forget that. But there are times when we have to do what we need to do to survive. And I said to that, I believe that's what Rabbi Sacks would have said.
I'm going to move on, but Dr. White, I'm going to move on based on what you said. The next question seems to be very appropriate. You talking about um, Abraham and how thoughtful, and the question is, what is the essence of Rabbi Sacks' outlook on thoughtful leadership? And how does the Jonathan Sacks Institute work to develop leaders who are grounded in that vision? I think, you know what, that's appropriate because some of the ethical dilemmas and some of the schisms here, people are blaming on not having thoughtful leadership. So I would like you both to comment just on the concept of thoughtful leadership and how the Sacks Institute, is working to develop that concept. Dr. Rock,
Okay,
yeah. Professor Rynhold,
so
yeah.
I would say like this that Rabbi Sacks was about producing leaders, not followers. And what that means is he would not want us to treat him like the Lubavitcher Rebbe, like to pore over every syllable and try and second guess him. What he would like us to do is to be inspired by what he said and wrote and the kind of books and outlooks that he brought to us. I always say that we have created now, in light of that, two programs that I think that are particularly apposite, relevant to this question. The first one is we have a new undergraduate degree in politics, Jewish and general philosophy, and economics. And this is based on a degree at Oxford University that is very prestigious called PPE, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics. And it's considered an elite degree in Israel as well. And the goal is basically to encourage people to take this degree and hopefully to go on to leadership positions in politics and government and when I try and describe what's special about this course, what makes it different from Hebrew University, Tel Aviv University, and Oxford, I say like this. Imagine two bookshelves. One bookshelf with all the books that anyone studying philosophy, economics, and politics should read of Jonathan Sacks. What books should be on that shelf? And then let's go to Jonathan Sacks's bookshelf and say, when Jonathan Sacks wrote about all these issues, and he is unique in writing about all these issues, what books were on his shelf? And that's the essence of the degree. So it's unique in that there is no other degree in the world that integrates at a high level Jewish philosophy and Jewish thinking with both general philosophy, political science and political thought, and economics. And among those courses are things like Judaism and democracy, economy and democracy, economy and Judaism, um, and courses that integrate things and that's unique to Rabbi Sacks. The second thing that we are doing that's relevant is Bar-Ilan has a leadership program, which is inspired by Rabbi Sacks's book, The Home We Build Together. And one of the things we were talking about before is the need to have an inclusive identity or inclusive narrative that everyone can sign up to that's based on values and identity and not just interests. Now, when Israel was formed, so the overwhelming majority of Israelis were either secular, yeah, because they were Jewish and they were mainly secular, okay, or religious Zionist. Today, about 20% of all Israelis are Arab. And we are heading to a point where about 20% of Israelis will be ultra Orthodox. In other words, it's no longer possible to build a unified society purely purely based on Zionism as understood up to this point. But on the other hand, it can't exclude Zionism because that is the essence of the country and that is what the majority identify with. So our leadership program brings together religious and secular Israelis, including also ultra-Orthodox students and Arab students. And what we're trying to do there is it's a very, very selective program, and it takes students from all degrees, undergraduate, post and graduate, from every discipline. Could be chemistry, could be politics, could be Jewish studies. Yeah, we bring them together in a 2-year program, which they do together. And aside from leadership skills, they go and visit different communities in Israel. They they do courses of the Rabbi Sacks about interfaith dialogue and combating religious extremism. They do a course of his about some of the things Tanya spoke about. And our goal is to create a long-term alumni network that reaches across the whole of Israeli society. That is including ultra-Orthodox and Arab, but is grounded at the same time in the Jewish religious tradition, with the ideas that underpin Rabbi Sacks that are both Zionist, yeah, Jewish in terms of deeply rooted in the Jewish religious tradition, and also democratic. And so among the many programs that we do, those I think are two that are designed over a long period to create cohorts and graduates that will be tied together in alumni programs that hopefully can make a difference.
Professor Rynhold, it sounds fascinating. My question to you is, has there been tremendous interest shown by the students in this program? I mean, if I were a student, I would be excited. How has the student interest been gauged so far? Can you comment on that?
Yeah, so this was our first year. We only opened the PPE program in October, and we have a good first cohort. There was a lot of interest, but many of the students were unable to sign up this year because they're still in the army. They're still
Got it.
doing reserve duty. And so that was an
Got it.
issue. The leadership program had a massive response from the
Great.
students. There were many students that wanted to do it, out of which we chose 18 this year.
Wow.
You know, we want to have between
Hi.
16 to
Right.
20. And so, yeah, there is
Very nice.
interest.
Okay, but time is short, and this is going so well. I want to spend the rest of our time discussing anti-Semitism in the world today. So first, before we get into anti-Semitism around the world, can Dr. White, can you comment on how Rabbi Sacks would identify the core mission of today's colleges and universities? We lost you. Wait, we lost you.
You're on mute, Tanya.
Sorry.
God,
I just say one thing. I think that what Professor Rynhold said is very important, and I experienced it personally with my relationship with Rabbi Sacks. Rabbi Sacks did not want to create followers. He wanted to create leaders. And why? Because he believed that the Tanakh, that the Bible, was not just a theological revolution of polytheism to monotheism, but an anthropological revolution where we are no longer just the kind of pawns in the hands of the capricious gods, but God actually believes in us. We are now in the Bible, in a mode of covenant, and covenant means that we work in partnership with God, and that means that God believes that we have the capacity and the ability to change the world, to change ourselves, to change the world, to be leaders. And leadership means being imbued with a deep sense of agency. Now, Rabbi Sacks, because I'm going to refer you back to this first question, Rabbi Sacks believed that any change, is not through the mechanisms of the state or the market, but is actually through individual people and individual character formation, individual virtue. And all of these things have the effect of changing us, then changing our family, then changing our in concentric circles. And so Rabbi Sacks, when he speaks to you, whenever I know when he spoke to me when I was in university, whenever he spoke to university students, he would always say, leadership is not about the centralized political leadership. And by the way, we've seen that over the last 2 years. The leaders, unfortunately, in our country have failed us time and time again. And really, the people who are making a difference are those unbelievable soldiers, those unbelievable women at home with their kids, women on the battlefield, men on the battlefield, people who are working in the grassroots, in the messiness of the mud, in a very literal way, right? They are the ones who are the leaders. And I think for university students, the core challenge is how we nurture that kind of leadership. And I think it has to be through cultivating curiosity. That's obviously what university is meant to do. Through, encouraging ways to think differently, ways to think out the box, encouraging dialogue between different sectors, understanding that moral formation is not just about technical skills, but also obviously about the moral imagination and the way in which we engage with all types of information, all types of wisdom and knowledge, and creating a shared language for common leadership and common good. And I think that's exactly what the Rabbi Sacks Institute is aiming to do.
Very good. Okay, and here is the probably the most difficult question of our session today, dealing with how Jewish students respond to surging anti-Semitism on American campuses, and Israeli faculty responding to academic boycotts, as well as Jews suffering the burden of anti-Semitism, including Australia. How would Rabbi Sacks advise not just Jewish students, but Jews to behave and react in view of a trend that seems to be getting worse? That is really, really something that I'm sure people here would like to hear. If possible, I'm sure, as Professor Rynhold said before, we don't know exactly what Rabbi Sacks says, he's not here, but based on his teachings, what would you say? What would his reaction be? How we should try and move forward in this difficult environment? For both of you, please.
Okay. Yeah. So the first thing he would do is say Jews everywhere should stand up and be counted. One of the donors to the Sacks Institute is an Orthodox Jew who lives in North America, and he doesn't usually wear a kippah at work. On October the 8th, and since October the 8th, he's worn a kippah at work. And I think that is the first thing that Rabbi Sacks would say: stand up and be counted. The second thing I think that we see with Rabbi Sacks is, for him, there is, after the Holocaust, there is no argument for not having a Jewish state. There is no argument that holds water against the state of Israel existing as the home of the Jewish people. And that requires protection. And although Rabbi Sacks is very philosophical and, and very idealistic, he was prepared to be political on one issue and one issue only: anti-Semitism. I have never heard him criticize any political leader at all personally, except on one occasion. And that is when the head of the Labour Party at the time, Jeremy Corbyn, was encouraging anti-Semitism within his party. And Jonathan Sacks, live on BBC, said Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Semite. And I think that is really important, that the willingness to take this on. The other aspect I would say is Jonathan Sacks didn't just say he's an anti-Semite. What he was very good at is explaining to people, Jewish and non-Jewish, and this goes to how Jewish people should respond. Yeah, in general terms, why anti-Semitism is a threat not only to Jews but to a free society. In other words, it starts with the Jews, and this is something Rabbi Sacks said, but it never ends with the Jews. So I think those two things: stand up, be proud, be willing to fight politically. Again, that's not his usual thing, but do it. Yeah. And on the other hand, the way that you do it should be able to speak in a language that non-Jews and reasonable people can hear and understand because they don't spend their lives thinking about this. So they're open to being led astray by all sorts of things. And so it's incumbent on us to address that.
Thank you. Dr. White, would you like to comment on that too?
Yeah, I think I'll just refer back to where we are this current moment, historical Chag festival that we're celebrating, and that's Hanukkah. The rabbis tell us that we need to light the Hanukkah, and they ask the question, should we light it outside or should we light it inside the house? And the answer they give is that the ideal place is to light it on the threshold between the house and the outside world. Rabbi Sacks was somebody who I think one of his greatest contributions philosophically was his way in which he modeled the idea of the universal and the particular. When we light the Hanukkah candles, we're lighting Jewish light. That's our particular light. It's our particular wisdom. We fought against the Hellenists. They represented universal wisdom. Again, the story is it's history repeating itself. They represented the highest value of liberal society, and yet they wanted to rid the particularity of the Jews. Again, today we see the most liberal, open-minded so-called society wants to me too, except if you're a Jew. Okay, the particularity of the Jews is a threat to this kind of either very kind of open universalism or religious fundamentalism. And what is the way that we fight it? We fight it by standing on the threshold between universality and particularity. We say that we have a particular message to bring to the world. And if you stamp out our particularity, you will ultimately stamp out everything that's good about the world. And I really believe that one of the things Rabbi Sacks, and he said it, by the way, again and again, whenever he spoke about anti-Semitism, whether it's in his books, whether it's the lectures he gave, every single time he spoke about it, he said the following thing. He was a brilliant diagnostician, as I've said already, diagnostician. He understood very early on what anti-Semitism was. He brought in the brilliant analogy that's been used and adopted by many people, many of which don't even quote Rabbi Sacks anymore, where he speaks about the idea of anti-Semitism as a mutation, right? A mutation of something that's a virus that's continually mutated. But whenever he diagnosed what anti-Semitism was and what we're facing, he always says one thing. He said as follows. He says, anti-Semitism does not define us. That is fate. It's what happens to us. And we can never become the victims of our fate. Because if we become the victims of our fate, we go back to what we were before the Bible came along. We go back to being the pawns that are moved around, or by the gods or by fate. And Rabbi Sacks says that our job in the world is to teach the world what he calls the dignity of difference, to respect others, to respect their particularity. And we are meant to be a Judaism engaged in the world. We have a message to bring to the world, and that is that every single person is created in the image of God. Every single person is dignified and has dignity. And we need to teach that to the world. So if they try to stamp out our particularity, what we need to do is exactly as Jonathan said, we need to stand up proud. We need to ensure that we are not just victims of fate, but we are agents of destiny, that and he always used the quote, in Judaism, we should have less oi and more joy. We should recognize that we have something that is ours, that belongs to us, that we should be proud of. And I always say, whenever I read Rabbi Sacks's books, I feel as if I walk out of them and he's given me a crown to put on my head. I feel as if that I stand proud, I stand taller as a Jew when I read the things he writes, because he reminds me not just about our history of being persecuted, but he reminds me that Judaism is about so much more than what happens to us. It's about what we've brought to the world, the legacy that we've left, the imprint we've left on the history of humanity. And so I'll finish perhaps with a beautiful story. He said he once went to Eilat with his wife Elaine, and he said it was very difficult to find in Eilat something for a rabbi to do. So they went on some, I don't know, underwater ship, or I don't know, whatever it was. And there was the driver of the boat. And the driver of the boat said, "Oh, where are you from?" And they said, "Oh, we're from London." "Oh, I was just in London." "Oh, London is amazing. It's beautiful. And the buildings, they're so old, and the people, they're so polite, and the grass, it's so green. There they are in a lot, no grass at all." And Rabbi Sacks said, "Yes, it is. It's beautiful." And then he stopped and he said, "Aval zeh shelanu." He looked around and he said, "Aval zeh shelanu," but this is ours. It may not be London. It may not have the oldest building. It definitely doesn't have the greenest grass. And the people are definitely not massively polite. But this is ours. And I think that's what Rabbi Sacks taught all of us. He taught
Beautiful.
Zeh shelanu. This is our particular message. This is our particular religion. And we need to hold it and be proud and not just be victims of our fate.
Beautiful. Very powerful words, Dr. White. I'm just going to ask you just in one or two sentences because we're closing out our hour. And for people who have questions, we've had such an elucidating conversation. We won't have time to get the questions, but we will submit them to both of our guests, and hopefully there'll be some type of response. I'm sure there will be to people who have these questions. We're not forgetting you. We just cannot do this in the short period of time. But we're going to close with one simple question. And it is, after everything that Israel's endured, what gives you hope right now for your students, for Am Yisrael, and everything that things in the future will improve? Just a very quick answer from both of you. So, summary answer.
You want to go, Joe?
You go first.
Yeah.
So I would say like this: Rabbi Sacks, one of his most famous quotes is, "Optimism is the belief that everything will be okay. And hope is the belief that together we will make things okay." What gives me hope is living in Israel, looking at my daughter's generation, of their belief in the future, of the fact that they're working. They're not just passively believing that the future is going to come. They're working towards that future. They believe things will change. They are the most inspirational generation, inspirational kids. I say, if I want hope, I wake up in the morning and I watch my daughter and her friends. They are bringing hope to us. And I really believe that leadership that Rabbi Sacks really believed we imbue into every individual, because God believes in us. So why shouldn't we believe in ourselves? That covenantal partnership, that to me is what brings hope.
Thank you. Dr. Rynhold,
I can only echo what Tanya said. And for me, even though there is great disappointment with the leadership, I'll tell you a little story in Modi'in that tells you just how impressive Israeli society has been in this war. Two little stories. Number one, I had to do a committee meeting with a professor from another university, secular woman. What was she doing? Well, she said, "Look, I can't do it from my office. I pick fruit to help the kibbutzim on the border of Gaza at this time of the week." So she did it from a car. She took an hour off because every day, once a week, she goes and does this. And the other story is when they had to evacuate large number of people from the northern border, and the government wasn't doing anything, they didn't know what was going on. So headmaster of a school in Modi'in, where I live, rings up headmaster in the north of Israel, says, "You don't know me, but I've got a gym. I can set up 3 classes. I've spoken to the parents, and we can put up X number of children with these number of families. And my third cousin, twice removed, drives a bus, and he'll bring you all down here." Right? And that has been Israel in this war. It's been absolutely incredible to see what people are willing to do and how they've done it. And really, I can only really praise the people of Israel for their amazing contribution. And I see it with my students, and it's quite unbelievable that they're really actually unaware of how impressive this is. So I think we can see hope in our population, which is a wonderful thing.
Amen. Thank you, Professor Rynhold, Dr. White, for sharing these not only powerful, but very inspiring perspectives with us today. We can emerge from this conversation with a powerful framework for navigating the challenging issues that we face. To everyone who joined us today, thank you very much for being part of this really critical conversation. We apologize again for any questions we're not able to get to, but if you have any queries, and we have a lot of them already online, if you haven't yet sent them in, you can email to webinar at afbiu.org. Again, webinar at afbiu.org. In closing, it's important to say that the Jonathan Sacks Institute represents just one example of how Bar-Ilan's academic infrastructure serves to strengthen the Jewish future worldwide. Together, we can help the university's cutting-edge programs continue to make a global impact. For those who are able to support us, you can do so by clicking on the link included in the comment section here on Zoom, or by navigating directly to the donation page on the American Friends Bar-Ilan website. Thank you again, and we wish everybody a happy Hanukkah and a great day. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Hanukkah Sameach.
Hanukkah Sameach.